Hey guys, Max here from Australian Vaporizers, and today I'm going to go through some general tips and tricks to help you to get the best performance from your vaporizer, regardless of manufacturer, model, etc. Dry herb vapes are really interesting things. The principles behind them are relatively simple, but there are so many influential variables to consider when it comes to actually using one. If you happen to be having problems with your current unit, or you're just looking for a little performance boost, there are a few simple steps you can take to get the results you're after. Aside from the vaporizer itself, the biggest performance influencing factor is your herb. Different types, different strains, and even just different batches can yield completely different results. I've had some material that's vaporized beautifully at lower temps, and others that have barely produced any visible vapor at all, even at higher temperatures. Now I know this isn't exactly something that everybody can control, but there are a few herb-related things that you certainly can. The first thing is moisture content. A lot of people just say the drier the better, but that's not always correct. I've found that there's a sweet spot between too moist and too dry. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's still better to be on the drier side of the scale, but if it becomes too dry and crispy, it can affect the potency of the material. The best thing to do here is to store it in an airtight and, if possible, UV resistant container to keep it fresh for as long as possible. Once your material's in storage, try to avoid opening the container where possible. It's definitely worthwhile having a separate, smaller container for everyday usage and then just restock that occasionally. If you're storing the majority of your material for a long time, then humidity control packets like this one also work quite well to maintain a specific moisture level, so that's definitely worth checking out. They come in a lot of different humidity levels, so I'd probably grab a few different ones, starting with probably 62%, just to experiment with. Depending on the vaporizer that you're using, grind consistency can also have a big impact on vapor production. Most vapes call for a reasonably fine grind to promote good surface area for heat coverage. There are a few exceptions, namely the Firefly 2, the Vapeolution 3, and the Herbal Air, but you can pretty much count it as a rule of thumb otherwise. When I say fine though, I don't mean to dust. Most vapes use mesh filters, so if the herb's too fine, it'll clog those filters, and you'll have to clean it all out much more often. If you find that your herb won't grind to a fine consistency or it's sticking together and clumping up, that's usually a sign that it's too moist. If this is the case, I'd recommend leaving at least a daily portion of your herb on a sheet of paper or a plate to dry out. Not for too long, 15 to 30 minutes should do the trick, but it'll depend on how moist it was, so check it frequently just to be safe. Temperature is a very widely discussed topic in the vaping community, and for good reason. A lot of units these days give you full control to the degree, making it really difficult to decide on a temp to use, especially if you're switching between different herbs fairly often. You'll hear a lot of people recommend magic bullet temperatures, but there are way too many variables in play to be that general about it. It's always best to work this out on a case-by-case basis, and the easiest way to do that is to start off quite low and work your way up in 5-degree increments. If you have a vape with preset temperatures, just use one preset per jump. I usually start at about 180 degrees Celsius, but the lower you start, the safer you'll be. Once the temp's stabilized, then take a few draws and adjust accordingly. So there are a few different ways to determine whether you're running too hot or too cool. Firstly is harshness. Everyone's lungs are different, and if you're experiencing any sort of discomfort while you're drawing, it's best to drop the temperature. Secondly is taste. To put it as simply as possible, if you taste anything close to burning, drop the temp. Your herb will always taste a little bit toasty towards the end of a session, but it should never taste burnt. Next is vapor production. As I mentioned before, some herb just won't produce much, if any, visible vapor. But if this is happening and you're not experiencing a burnt taste or discomfort in the lungs, then I'd definitely bump the temperature up. Lastly is the color of your material. After a number of draws, your herb will eventually stop producing vapor, provided that it was producing some to start with. Once this happens, open your filling chamber and have a look inside. It should be just a few shades darker. If it started as a light brown or green, and it's discolored to a very dark brown or a black, I would definitely be turning the temperature down. I'm just going to finish this section by saying that these are just guidelines. At the end of the day, temperature selection is for the most part a personal preference thing. There's definitely a balance point between satisfaction and respiratory health, but this point is different for just about everyone. So regardless of your personal preference, once you go through this trial and error phase, you'll quickly establish a go-to temp. Just be mindful of different variables and start off low again if you have any doubts. The next section here is heat up. As technology advances, we're seeing vapes with quicker and quicker heat up times. While this is really convenient, it can pose issues because 9 times out of 10, the unit won't actually be ready to use straight away. If you wait about 20 seconds or so before taking your first draw, you'll be surprised how much better the results can be. Same applies to the rest of your draws too. Try taking a little rest in between, especially if you're using one of the smaller units like the Pax or the Alpha. Patience is a virtue, my friend. Draw style, in other words, the way you inhale, is another huge influencing factor. A lot of people have a hard time getting the technique down while others take to it like a duck to water. The general consensus is that slow, deep inhalations are the way to go, and I can definitely agree with that. There are a few exceptions, but not enough to really invalidate the claim. The theory behind slow draws is that too much airflow will tend to draw heat away from the element and cause it to cool down. I'm kind of simplifying here, but that's the general gist of it anyway. Most modern vapes are thermostat controlled to compensate for heat loss, but they can only feed so much power into the element at once. Some portables have a built-in draw resistance, which I'm still convinced is to prevent draw speed related heat loss. But for all of those units with great airflow, it's still best to draw slowly. Last but by no means least, maintenance. 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 Can't rave enough about this. Clean your unit. If you put this off, it can restrict airflow, it can cause your vape to overheat, it can in some cases damage electronics, it can do all sorts of funky things. If you've got a vape and you're not sure how to clean it, firstly read the instructions, or check YouTube for a video guide. Aside from that though, do yourself a favor and buy some isopropyl alcohol from your local hardware store, Officeworks, or JCar Electronics or something similar. In my opinion, it's by far the best solvent to use for cleaning glass, stainless steel, and certain types of plastic too. I'd also invest in a good brush. I use the Volcano brush, but there's a heap of different shapes and sizes to choose from. If you dust your chamber out after every use, you won't have to take it apart for a thorough clean as often. So there we have it everyone, some tips to live and vape by. Some of this might sound fairly obvious, but it still pays to consider all of these points regardless of how experienced you might be. At any rate, I hope you've all found this helpful. Thanks heaps for watching, and as usual, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to drop them below. This is Max from Australian Vaporizers. Have a good one.